Staff Sergeant Paul Boesch would later describe the sound as a giant tearing wet canvas overhead, and he meant it as a warning, not a metaphor. The shell that made that sound had already left the barrel of a German 88, arcing through November fog somewhere east of the tree line. It was not aimed at a man. It was aimed at a tree, at the crown of an 80-foot spruce, 40 feet above the forest floor, where a mechanical time fuse in the nose had been set to burst it not on impact but early, in the air, among the branches. That distinction killed men who thought they were safe. Out in the open, a soldier hears artillery and drops flat. The ground absorbs the blast. The fragments spray outward and upward, and a man pressed into the dirt has a decent chance. The dirt is his friend. Every rifleman learned that in training, learned it so deeply it became reflex, the body throwing itself down before the mind caught up. In the Hürtgen, that reflex got you killed. A shell fused to detonate in the treetops, sent its steel and a storm of splintered wood straight down, into the exact posture that had kept men alive from Normandy to the German border. So if you're watching this, and you carry a family name that belongs in this story, a grandfather, a great-uncle, a man whose letters stopped coming from that forest in the winter of 1944, put it in the comments, because these are the names that hold the whole thing together. A like and a subscribe keep this work going, and the names you leave are half of why it matters at all. Boesch was an infantry officer with the 8th and later the 28th Divisions, a former professional wrestler from Houston who fought his way into the Hürtgen and wrote about it afterward with a clarity most men couldn't manage. He survived. Thousands didn't. The Battle of Hürtgen Forest, ground on from September of 1944 into February of the next year, and the American casualty figures ran to roughly 33,000 across the divisions fed into it. That is a number the official histories still describe with words like costly and indecisive. Their words, chosen carefully, decades after the fact. Here is what the number doesn't tell you. Men who had crossed open beaches under machine gun fire, who had walked upright through hedgerow country while mortars walked toward them, arrived in the Hürtgen and felt something they hadn't felt before. Not the sharp fear of a firefight, something lower and more constant. The forest did not let them see the thing that was trying to kill them, and it took away the one move their bodies knew by heart. The trees stood close, so close in places that two men could barely pass between them, and the canopy locked overhead into a roof that swallowed daylight at noon. 50 square miles of it, dense conifer planted in rows by German foresters generations earlier, the ground beneath a carpet of needles and root and mud that stayed wet from October on. Tanks couldn't maneuver in it. Radios cut out among the trunks. A man could lose his platoon 15 feet from where he stood. And into that closed green ceiling, the German gunners fired their shells to burst. The technical name for it is airburst, and there was nothing new about the physics. What was new was the terrain doing the artillery's work for it. In open country, a gunner needs a precise time fuse or a proximity fuse to get a shell to explode at the right height, and even then, the effect scatters. In the Hürtgen, the Germans barely needed precision. A shell fired into the forest with a contact fuse would strike a tree, some tree, any tree. The woods were nothing but targets, and detonate on the trunk or the branches, and the burst came from above whether the gunner had planned it or not. The forest turned every shell into an overhead shell. The Germans understood this. They had surveyed these firing lanes in advance, registered their guns on the trails and fire breaks and clearings where Americans would have to move, and they waited. For the rifleman in his hole, the arithmetic was brutal. Dig deeper, the standard survival response, and you were still open at the top, still exposed to fragments falling vertically. The only real protection was overhead cover, logs laid across the foxhole, and cutting those logs meant standing up with an axe in a forest being shelled. Men died getting the timber that was supposed to keep them alive. A few stopped bothering, while others pressed against the downhill side of a trunk and prayed the tree took the burst. Boesch remembered watching a man simply refuse to leave his covered hole, unable to make his legs carry him back into the open air, and he did not blame him. The forest inverted everything the American infantry had learned to trust. The sky, which in open battle was a place you glanced at for aircraft and otherwise ignored, became the direction death came from. Up was the danger. Down was no longer safe. And a soldier's hardest trained instinct, the drop and flat that had carried him this far, now betrayed him with each shell that tore through the canvas of the air above his head. To understand why grown veterans came to fear this place more than any field they'd crossed, you have to start with that ceiling of trees, 50 square miles. That is the size of the thing, and it is worth sitting with the number for a moment, because 50 square miles of German forest held no city, no river crossing anyone strictly needed, no industry, no rail junction that would collapse the enemy line if it fell. The Hürtgen sat southeast of Aachen, a green smear on the map between the American First Army and the Roer River beyond it. The generals looked at it and saw an obstacle to be cleared before the real prize. The men sent into it found that the obstacle was the battle. The stated reason for going in changed depending on which headquarters you asked. Early on, the concern was the flank, a fear that German forces massing in the woods could strike the American advance toward the Roer. Later, the justification shifted to the Roer dams at the southern edge of the forest, the reservoirs the Germans could open to flood the river valley and drown any crossing downstream. The dams were a real reason. The bitter part is that the American drive spent months grinding through the northern and central forest before anyone made the dams the actual objective, and by then, the divisions were already bled white. The geography that mattered was at the bottom of the map. The dying happened at the top. I think the plainest way to say it is that the American command fought the Hürtgen because it was there and kept fighting it because stopping felt like admitting the first decision had been a mistake. Division after division went in. The 9th went first in September and came out shredded, having gained a few thousand yards at a cost that should have ended the whole enterprise. Then, the 28th, the Pennsylvania National Guard, sent up the Kall trail toward the village of Schmidt in November, walking into a ruin so complete the division's own after-action reporting reads like a coroner's file. Then, the 4th, the 8th, the 1st, the 5th Armored, pieces of others, fed in through the fall and into December, each one relearning the same lesson the last one had paid for. The Germans, for their part, did almost nothing clever. That should make an American reader angry. They did not need to be clever. A German commander sitting in the Hürtgen held every card the terrain handed him, and the terrain handed him all of them. The forest canceled the American way of war item by item, and the German officers understood this with a cold precision that comes through plainly in their post-war accounts. American air superiority, total over the Western Front by late 1944, meant nothing under a canopy that hid the ground from the pilots overhead. The jabos that had made German daylight movement suicidal in Normandy circled uselessly above a roof of spruce, unable to see a target, unable to tell friend from enemy in the murk below. American armor, which had broken out across France, could not deploy on trails wide enough for a single tank, where a disabled panzer or a fallen trunk plugged the whole advance. American artillery, the finest and most responsive fire support system any army fielded in the war, lost half its edge when forward observers could not see past the next rank of trees. General Major Rudolf von Gersdorff, Chief of Staff of the German 7th Army, wrote afterward for the American Historical Division about this ground, and his assessment of the American offensive was blunt. He called the fighting in the Hürtgen among the heaviest and most costly he had witnessed, and he understood exactly why the Americans kept bleeding. They were attacking in the one kind of country where the attacker forfeits his strengths and the defender keeps all of his. The Germans dug in on the reverse slopes, registered their mortars and their 88s on the fire breaks, strung wire, and laid mines across the few passable trails, and waited for the American infantry to come to them through terrain that funneled men into exactly the killing zones the guns already covered. A German defensive line in open country is a thing that air power and artillery and armor can pry apart. A German defensive line in the Hürtgen was a thing that only riflemen could take, one tree at a time, on foot, in the rain, against an enemy they could not see until they were on top of him. The forest stripped the battle down to its oldest and cruelest form, man against man in the dark under the trees, and it did so at the exact moment in the war when American material superiority had grown overwhelming everywhere the sky was open. So the advantage that had carried the American army from the beaches to the German frontier simply stopped at the tree line. Inside, the mud pulled the boots off wounded men. The cold came early, and the trench foot came with it, filling the aid stations with soldiers who had never been hit. The days shortened until there were barely 8 hours of gray light, and the shells kept coming down out of the branches, and the villages at the far edge, Schmidt, Fossenach, Kommerscheid, changed hands and changed back and filled with the dead of both armies. 50 square miles of nothing, and the American infantry paid for every acre of it in a currency the factories back home could not replace. 19 September, 1944. The 9th Infantry Division stepped off the roads east of the German frontier and into the trees, and for a few hundred yards, the war they knew went with them. Then it didn't. Look at what an American infantry division carried into a fight by that autumn. It moved with tanks in support, tank destroyers, self-propelled guns, whole battalions of artillery, on call within minutes of a radio request. Overhead flew the P-47s that had spent the summer turning German columns into scrap along the roads of France. A rifleman in open country was never really alone. Behind him stood a machine that could put steel on any target he could point to, and put it there faster than any army on earth. That machine was the reason the Germans had run all the way back from Normandy, the reason a private from Ohio could walk toward a dug-in enemy and believe he'd win. The forest took the machine apart piece by piece, and it did so quietly, without a battle, in the first hours. Start with the tanks. A Sherman needs room, needs a field of fire, needs ground firm enough to turn on and wide enough to flank with. The Hürtgen offered none of it. The fire breaks and logging trails ran narrow and straight, so a single anti-tank gun sighted down one of them could kill the lead tank and trap every tank behind it, nose to tail, unable to turn, unable to pass the burning wreck ahead. The mud finished what the geometry started. Tracks sank, through, spun. Armor that had raced across France in August sat useless at the tree line in September, and the infantry went in without it. Now the air power, and this is the part that should sting. By late 1944, American and British aircraft owned the sky over the Western Front so completely that German soldiers had a bitter joke about it. If the plane overhead was silver, it was American. If it was invisible, it was the Luftwaffe. That dominance had cost years to build and thousands of trained pilots to pay for. And it bought almost nothing in the Hürtgen, because the pilot who could not see the ground could not help the man standing on it. The canopy locked the forest floor away, under a roof of spruce that held even in winter, needles thick enough that a fighter bomber at 300 miles an hour saw only an unbroken green surface with an occasional thread of smoke. Where were the German lines? Where were the American ones? From the cockpit, there was no telling the two apart, and a pilot who guessed wrong killed his own. So the P-47s that had made German daylight movement a form of suicide circled above the trees and went home with their bombs, and the infantry went in without them too. That leaves the artillery, and here the loss was subtler and worse. American gunnery was the best in the world in 1944, and everyone who faced it said so. The strength of it was never just the weight of shell. It was the speed and flexibility of the system behind it, the fire direction centers that could mass the guns of an entire corps onto one target inside a few minutes of a forward observer's call. But that whole apparatus rested on one thing: a man who could see the target and correct the fall of shot. In open country, the observer sat on a hill or in a tree or in a spotter plane and watched the rounds land, walking them onto the enemy with a few words over the radio. In the Hürtgen, he could see the next rank of trunks and nothing beyond. The observation that made American artillery deadly simply did not exist under the canopy, and half the system's genius died with it. The guns still fired. They fired blind, on map coordinates, into woods where the falling rounds were as likely to burst in the trees above friendly holes as enemy ones. So here is the riddle, and it is worth stating plainly. The American army that entered the Hürtgen in September of 1944 was, by every measurable standard, the most materially dominant force on the Western Front. It had more tanks, more planes, more guns, more shells, more trucks, more of everything than the enemy it faced, and it had spent the summer proving what that superiority could do to a German army caught in the open. Then it walked into 50 square miles of trees, and the advantage evaporated, and the same divisions that had chased the Wehrmacht across France found themselves stalled, bled, and beaten back by a defender who was outnumbered and outgunned, and who did almost nothing but wait. Why? That is the question this whole story turns on. Why did open field superiority, the thing that won the war everywhere the sky was clear, mean nothing here, in this specific patch of German woodland against this specific enemy? The short answer is that the forest did not cancel American strength by matching it. It canceled American strength by making it irrelevant, by removing the conditions, room, sight lines, observation, that every one of those advantages depended on to work. Strip those conditions away, and the richest army in the world is reduced to what it has always come down to in the end. A young man with a rifle, in the wet dark, walking toward a machine gun he cannot see. And the Germans knew exactly how to feed that young man into the trees. 11.5 pounds. That is roughly what a German 105mm shell weighed in explosive filler and steel casing when it left the tube. And when that casing ruptured, it broke into somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 fragments, most of them smaller than a fingernail, all of them moving faster than sound. In the open, physics did the American infantry a favor. The shell struck earth. The ground below the burst absorbed a third of the fragments outright, and the rest sprayed in a low cone that swept outward at roughly a man's height. Drop flat, and you took most of that cone over your back. Now raise the burst 40 feet. That is the number that matters, and it is worth holding on to, because 40 feet is about where the spruce crowns closed in the Hürtgen. A shell that detonated up in that canopy owed the ground nothing. No dirt caught the low fragments. The whole sphere of steel was free to travel, and gravity handed the downward third of it straight onto the men below, into foxholes, onto the pressed flat bodies that open-field doctrine had trained into every one of them. The forest did not just neutralize American artillery doctrine. It took the physics that made that doctrine lethal and turned it around to face the wrong way. The next part is where it turns cruel. The American army had spent the war perfecting exactly this weapon against the Germans. The proximity fuse, the VT fuse, one of the great secret programs of the war, a tiny radar in the nose of a shell that sensed the ground rushing up and fired the burst at optimal killing height, no observer required. It reached the field artillery in the winter of 1944, and against German troops caught in the open at the Bulge, it was devastating. A shell that burst itself at the perfect altitude to rain fragments down on men who thought a foxhole would save them. American gunners called the effect what it was. The forest gave the Germans the same effect for free. Every trunk was a fuse. Every branch set the height. The Hürtgen was a proximity fuse airburst that the Germans never had to pay for, delivered onto American heads by the trees themselves. The symmetry of it is grim. The capability the United States built in secret laboratories and guarded like a crown jewel, the enemy got handed by geography, and it got used on the men who invented it. The casualty ledger shows what that meant in bodies. Across the divisions fed into the forest, the medical reporting broke the wounds down by cause, and the fragment wounds, shell and mortar, and the splintered wood, the bursts drove through the air like a second volley of shrapnel, ran to something like 3/4 of the total. Not bullets, steel and timber falling from above. The rifle fight everyone pictured when they thought of infantry combat was the minority of the killing here. Most men who went down to something they never saw, fired by a gunner who never saw them, burst at a height set by a tree neither of them chose, and the wood itself was a weapon. This is the detail the survivors kept coming back to. When a shell burst in a pine crown, it did not only throw its own steel, it shattered the tree, and a shattered 80-foot conifer became a shower of splinters, whole limbs, jagged staves of green wood, driven downward with enough force to impale a man. The aid stations filed wounds from wood that read exactly like wounds from shell fragments. A soldier under overhead cover was safe from the steel and still not safe from the tree coming down on top of him. You could hear it coming, and that was the worst of it. The sound Boesch described, the tearing wet canvas overhead, was the shell arriving, and by the time a man's ear placed it, the burst was already in the branches above him, and the fragments were already on their way down. There was no warning that did any good, no time to move that mattered. The interval between hearing and dying collapsed to nothing, and a soldier lay in his hole listening to that sound come again and again, night after night, knowing the one thing his body knew how to do would not help. Do the arithmetic on a single German battery then. 4 guns, each capable of a shell every few seconds, firing on a fire break registered days in advance into woods where the canopy set every fuse. A minute of that put dozens of airbursts over a company's position, each one flinging its downward third of 1,000-odd fragments, plus a rain of splintered spruce onto men who had no cover overhead, because cutting cover meant standing up into the next salvo. The German gunner did not need to adjust. He did not need to observe. He needed a map, a registered target, and shells, and the forest converted every round. He fired into the precise weapon American scientists had spent millions to build. That is the technical core of it, stripped down to the numbers. Not German brilliance, not some new gun. Just 11.5 pounds of steel, a canopy at 40 feet, and a downward-facing third of every burst, multiplied across 50 square miles and 5 months. The men in the holes did not know the math. They only knew the sound, and what always followed it. They keep coming. That is the phrase that recurs in the German accounts of Schmidt, and it is not admiration exactly. It reads closer to disbelief, the tone of a man describing something that violates a rule he thought both armies understood. The 28th Infantry Division was National Guard, Pennsylvania men, the red keystone on the shoulder that the Germans facing them soon rendered in their own reports as a bloodstain. On the 2nd of November, 1944, the division attacked toward 3 villages on the high ground, Wassenach, Kammerscheid, and Schmidt itself, down a single muddy thread called the Kall Trail, a track so narrow that later the engineers could barely get a tank across it without the vehicle sliding off into the gorge. The plan asked one reinforced regiment, the 112th, to take Schmidt and hold it. For a few hours on the 3rd of November, it worked. The infantry walked into Schmidt, and the village was theirs. Then the Germans counterattacked, and the thing that had held the whole American way of war together came apart on that trail. The tanks sent to reinforce Schmidt could not get down the Kall. The gorge was a shelf of greasy rock and root, and the Shermans threw tracks, bellied, blocked one another exactly as the geometry of the forest guaranteed they would. A handful clawed through to Kammerscheid. The rest sat stranded on a hillside, while the men forward waited for armor that arrived in 1s and 2s, or not at all. German tanks and assault guns came into Schmidt against American infantry, who had almost nothing to stop them, and the Pennsylvania men were driven out of the village they had taken, back across open ground that German gunners on the ridges had already ranged. What happened on that withdrawal is in the record, and it is hard to read. Men were cut down crossing the fields between Schmidt and Kommerscheid, in full view of the enemy. The wounded who could move dragged themselves back up the Kall trail, through mud that sucked at them, past the burning tanks, under the tree bursts that never stopped coming down through the canopy. An aid station set up in a stone bunker halfway down the gorge, and there, in one of the few moments of the whole battle that ought to be taught forever, German and American medics worked out an informal truce over the trail, passing wounded of both sides through the same crossing point, because no one could evacuate anybody under fire. The Germans held the high ground and let the Americans carry their broken men out. It is documented, and it tells you what kind of place had made even the enemy stop shooting for a few hours. The truce was not mercy handed down from strength. It was two exhausted armies agreeing that the ground itself had become the enemy of both. And still, the division was ordered to hold, and still the men held what little they had. And this is the part the German commanders could not fit into their understanding of the fight. Gersdorff and the other officers who wrote it up afterward described the American persistence in terms that keep circling the same idea, that the attacks continued past the point where continuing made any military sense, that the Americans fed men into ground where no attacker could win and kept feeding them after the outcome was plain. From the German side of the wire, that looked less like tactics than like something closer to fatalism. They had registered every fire break. They knew the trail. They watched the columns come down it, and they killed the columns, and the next day there was another column. The cost, stated plainly, was this: the 28th Division took something on the order of 6,000 casualties in the Schmidt operation, a third of its combat strength gone in roughly 2 weeks, one of the worst maulings any American division suffered in the entire war in Europe. The 112th Regiment was effectively destroyed as a fighting force and had to be rebuilt around the survivors. 6,000 men, for 3 villages on a ridge, taken, lost, and left in German hands when the division was finally pulled out to refit. The number does not show the smell that veterans of the Kall named again and again when they were old men, cordite and wet earth, and the sweet rot of bodies that could not be recovered from the gorge, some of which stayed there into the following spring. It does not show the sound layered under the shell fire, the small human noise of wounded men in the ravine at night, calling, that the living could hear and could not always reach. It does not show the gray light going out of the sky at 4 in the afternoon, and the men in the holes, knowing they had 14 hours of dark ahead, with the tree bursts walking across their positions on a schedule the German gunners set by the clock. The riddle this whole story has been circling resolves right here, in the mud of the Kall. The Americans did not lose their edge at Schmidt because the Germans outfought them. They lost it because they carried the most powerful army on earth into the one arena that stripped every advantage away. And then, out of pride or momentum, or the simple refusal to admit the First Order had been wrong, they kept sending men into it. The Germans watched them come, and they wrote down afterward that they had never understood why the Americans did not stop. Budi Cianciato took his boots off once in 9 days, and when he did, the skin came with them. That is not a figure of speech. A medic in the 28th wrote it down almost that plainly, describing feet gone the color of a bruise, swollen past the shape of a foot, The sock fused to flesh that had been wet and cold and unmoving for over a week inside a hole that never drained. Trench foot does not need a wound. It needs cold water, tight boots, and time, and the Hürtgen supplied all three in surplus. The mechanism is simple, and it is ugly. Feet left wet and cold for days stop getting blood. The tissue starves, the nerves die back so a man cannot feel his own feet anymore, and then the flesh begins to rot on a living body. In the worst cases, the toes blackened, and the surgeons took them, sometimes the forefoot, sometimes more. A soldier who never saw a German, never fired his rifle, could be carried out of that forest and lose both feet to standing water in a foxhole. The arithmetic is worth staying with. Across the fight for the forest, the divisions lost more men to the cold and the wet and the mind than some of them lost to German steel. The numbers are in the medical reports, and they are not close. Trench foot alone put something on the order of 9,000 Americans out of action across the Hürtgen campaign. Whole rifle companies subtracted from the order of battle by weather. Add the respiratory illness, the exposure, the men who simply stopped functioning, and the non-battle casualties rival the killed and wounded. An army that had beaten German logistics across all of France was being disarmed, one soldier at a time, by rain and 40 degrees. From inside the hole, it looked like this. A man in the Hürtgen lived in a hole half full of water he could not bail, because bailing meant movement, and movement drew the tree bursts. He could not build a fire, because smoke drew the same. He could not walk to warm himself, because walking meant crossing open ground, already ranged by German guns. So he sat, hour after hour, day after day, in freezing water up to his shins, and his feet died slowly underneath him, while he was still using them to stand watch. The instinct that keeps a man alive, stay low, stay still, stay hidden, was the exact instinct that rotted his feet off. That is the second betrayal of the forest, and it runs parallel to the first. The tree burst turned drop and flat into a death sentence. The waterlogged foxhole turned stay hidden into an amputation. Every survival reflex the army had drilled into these men worked against them here, and the harder a soldier obeyed his training, the more certainly the place took him apart. And then there was the mind, which the forest broke last and worst. They called it combat exhaustion by then, the army having learned in Tunisia and Sicily to stop calling it cowardice. What it meant in the Hürtgen was men who had listened to the tearing canvas sound of incoming shells for 2 weeks straight, day and night, never dry, never warm, watching the trees come apart above their friends, and who reached a point where the mind simply refused to carry any more. Some wept and could not stop. Some sat and stared and did not answer when spoken to. Some shook so hard they could not hold a rifle. A few walked out of their holes into the open, toward the guns, past caring. The clinical name for the tipping point is worth keeping, because the Army's own psychiatrists chose it. They concluded that nearly every man has a breaking point, that combat exhaustion was not a defect of weak soldiers, but the predictable end state of strong ones exposed long enough. Their phrase for the Hürtgen conditions was that they produced psychiatric casualties at a rate the replacement system could not match. Their words. The forest was manufacturing broken men faster than the army could feed whole ones in. Now the full shape of it comes clear. 6,000 casualties in the 28th, 9,000 trench foot cases across the campaign. thousands more mines that gave out under a sound that never stopped. And the ground itself, Schmidt, Wassenach, Kommerscheid, 50 square miles of splintered spruce, held no city, no river crossing, no rail junction, nothing the war strictly needed. That is the resolution of the riddle this whole story set out to answer, and it is bleaker than any German victory. American riflemen came to fear the Hürtgen more than any open battlefield, not because the enemy was better, but because the forest turned every one of their advantages into a liability and every one of their survival instincts into a slow method of self-destruction. The open field, for all its terror, at least let a man's training save him. The forest punished him for everything the army had taught him to do. The men who came out did not talk about it much, and the ones who did came back to the same handful of sensory facts every time. The wet that never left the feet, the gray that never became daylight, and the sound overhead, the tearing canvas that followed them home and woke them decades later in dry beds in Pennsylvania. A private from Ohio walked into those trees in September, believing the machine behind him would win his war. The machine stayed on the roads. He went in alone. 16th of February, 1945. The last German resistance in the forest collapsed, and the Hürtgen fell into American hands after 5 months and roughly 33,000 American casualties. The dam on the Roer, the objective that had made the whole ground worth taking in the first place, sat behind the tree line the whole time, and the Germans opened its floodgates before the Americans could exploit anything, flooding the valley and delaying the advance by 2 more weeks. So the forest was taken. What it had been taken for was underwater. That is the summary a staff officer might write, and it explains nothing about why the place became the byword it became. The forest proved something, and it is worth saying plainly. The United States had built, by the autumn of 1944, a war machine that no enemy on earth could stop in the open. American artillery ranged and massed faster than any gunnery the world had seen. American air power owned the sky over the Western Front so completely that German columns moved at night or not at all. American logistics put more shells, more fuel, more food, and more men across a beach and up to a front than the German quartermasters could imagine, let alone match. Every German general who wrote his account afterward for the American historians came back to the same helpless arithmetic. They could not compete with the abundance. They could only wait for terrain or weather to take it away. And in the Hürtgen, terrain took it away. Not German skill. The forest. The canopy that turned every shell into an airburst. The trails too narrow for the tanks. The mud that grounded the trucks. The 8 hours of gray light. The water in the holes. The single arena on the entire Western Front where the American machine could not deploy the thing that made it the American machine. Strip a rifleman of his artillery, his armor, his air cover, and his dry feet, and you have done to him the one thing the Wehrmacht could never do by force of arms. You have made the fight fair, and a fair fight was the only kind the Germans had any chance of winning by 1944, which is exactly why they fought so hard to keep it inside the trees. That is the shape of the whole thing. American power was so total that only ground which disarmed the Americans could blunt it, and the Germans knew it, and they held that ground with everything they had because it was the last place their professionalism still counted for something. The men who fought there understood it in their bones long before the historians wrote it down. Hemingway, who went in as a correspondent and came out shaken, called the Hürtgen Passchendaele with tree bursts, reaching back to the worst name the previous war had produced because the current war had not yet made a word bad enough. The soldiers who survived it used plainer language. They called it the death factory, the green hell, the meat grinder. What they were describing, every one of them, was the sensation of watching the strongest army in history be reduced man by man to a cold, wet individual with a rifle and a broken pair of feet in the one forest that could do it. The generals who ordered it never fully accounted for the decision. The battle was fought in pieces, division after division, fed into the same ground, on the same assumptions, and the after-action reviews read like men trying to explain a thing they could not quite believe they had done. Some of the ground taken in November was ground the 9th Division had bled for in September and lost. The same fire breaks, the same trails, the same registered airbursts coming down through the same canopy onto new men who had never heard the sound before and learned it in an afternoon. The forest is still there. It grew back. The spruce that the shellfire stripped to splinters was replanted after the war, and the Hürtgenwald today is a working German forest again, walked by hikers on marked trails, some of which run along the old Kall track, where the Shermans threw their tracks and the medics passed the wounded across the line. Rusted ordnance still comes up out of the ground when the earth is disturbed, and the German bomb disposal teams still clear it, decades on. The wounded of the Kall Gorge, who could not be recovered that winter, were found in the spring and after, and the American dead of the campaign lie mostly at the Henri Chapelle and Ardennes cemeteries in Belgium, under the white crosses, 40 minutes' drive from the trees that killed them. A few of the Shermans that slid off the Kall trail were dragged out and repaired, and sent forward again into the drive to the Rhine, where the ground opened up, and the American machine became itself once more and rolled to the river in weeks. One of them, hauled up out of the gorge and put back on its tracks, was running east with the First Army before the month was out. The men who came out of the forest in February were pulled back, refitted, given dry socks and hot food and replacements to fill the holes in the ranks. The Roer flood receded. On the 23rd of February, the artillery opened along the whole line. The engineers put their boats in the water, and the divisions that had survived the trees crossed the river and kept going toward Germany.